picture this. It's around 2016, 2017. Trauma-informed practice is having its moment. It's everywhere. Conferences, district newsletters, professional development catalogs. The research is compelling. The language is spreading, and schools across the country are starting to say, we're going trauma-informed. And your district is one of them. Big push, district-wide. They bring in a consultant for a full-day professional development, and every teacher, every staff member, every administrator is sitting in the gym listening to a presentation about ACEs. And you're sitting there thinking, yes, this is the shift we needed. Ask what happened to them instead of what's wrong with them. Get curious instead of punitive. Stop suspending kids for survival behaviors. And you leave that training feeling hopeful. 6 months later, a 6th grader has been verbally assaulting his teacher for weeks. Profanity, threats, and when you raise the question of consequences, somebody in the room says he has a high ACE score. We can't hold him accountable right now. That would be re-traumatizing. The teacher looks at you with these eyes that seem to say, I am burning out in real time and no one is helping me. Or maybe it goes like this. You've got a student who is genuinely struggling, shutting down, falling behind, isolating. And your school's response is, she's been through a lot. Let's give her some grace. Let's reduce demands. Let's not push too hard. And she keeps falling further behind. Now, fast forward to today. We've been through COVID, through school closures, through kids coming back to buildings fundamentally changed, more dysregulated, more isolated, more behind. And we've got teachers and counselors who are exhausted, disrespected, and burning out at rates this profession has never seen before. And in a lot of those buildings, the response to all of that has been more trauma-informed training. Same framework, bigger problems, fewer resources, and that right there, that mismatch between the intention and what's actually happening is exactly what we're digging into today. Hey, school counselor, welcome back. In this episode, we're taking on trauma-informed schools and asking a question almost nobody asked before we built entire education systems around it. How many rigorous studies demonstrate that whole school trauma-informed models work? Because here's the problem, the science of trauma is real. The ACE research matters, and yet somewhere between the research and the rollout, something fell apart. Structure softened, discipline blurred, and school counselors became the pressure valve for discipline systems that stopped functioning. So if you're ready for some straight talk, my friend, some clarity on your work, and this week, a whole lot of rebellion, you are in the right place. I'm Steph Johnson, and this is the School for School Counselors podcast. To understand how we got here, I want to take you back to San Diego in the early 1990s. A physician named Vincent Folletti is running an obesity clinic at Kaiser Permanente. Big clinic, good outcomes on paper, but he has this problem he can't solve. It's a dropout problem. Patients are losing significant amounts of weight and then quitting his program. Not because they fail to lose the weight, they succeed and then they leave anyway. And so you might be thinking, wait, if they're losing the weight, why was that a problem? Doesn't losing the weight mean the program worked? Folletti was asking the same thing. So he started sitting down with the patients who dropped out and just actually asking them. And what he found was something that nobody expected. For many of these patients, the weight wasn't just weight. It was protection. Some had gained it after childhood abuse. Some described it, consciously or not, as a kind of armor. And when they started losing it, something in them panicked. The coping mechanism was disappearing before they'd put in anything to take its place. So they left the program not because it wasn't working, but in some ways because it was working too well, too fast, and without addressing what was underneath. So Folletti starts looking more closely, and here's what he finds. A lot of these patients are using food the same way someone else might use alcohol or cigarettes. It was managing the psychological weight of childhood experiences that they'd never told anyone about. And that clinical observation is what launched the ACE study. Folletti partnered with a CDC epidemiologist named Robert Anda, and together they surveyed more than 17,000 adults about 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, parents with substance abuse, a parent who was incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence. But I want you to know who these 17,000 adults were. They were mostly white, mostly middle class, college educated, insured in Southern California. These were not low-income families. They were not predominantly communities of color. These were not the populations that school-based trauma-informed programs would go on to target most heavily. That gap between who was studied and who the framework gets applied to is one of the reasons applying this research to school populations requires far more caution than most districts ever used. But I digress. Folletti and Anda tracked those responses against adult health outcomes, and the findings were jaw-dropping. The more ACE categories a person reported, the higher their risk for depression, substance abuse, suicide attempts, heart disease, and even cancer. The relationship was linear, it was clean, and it was dose-dependent. More ACEs meant more risk every single time. That study was published in 1998, and it became the scientific foundation for an entire movement. By 2014, the federal government had formalized what trauma-informed was supposed to look like. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, put out a framework built around 4 guiding principles that they called the 4 R's: realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. And schools made sense as a delivery point for this work. Kids spend more time in school than almost anywhere else. Trauma has documented effects on attention, memory, academic performance, and behavior. If you want to reach children early, school is where you go to do it. So by 2015, the legislative momentum was crazy. More than half of all federal trauma-informed bills introduced between 1973 and 2015 were introduced in that single year. Goodness. The movement had scientific credibility, it had federal endorsement, and 17,000 data points behind it. What it did not have, and here's where our story turns, was evidence that whole school trauma-informed approaches actually worked. Hold on to that. So before I tell you what went wrong, I do have to be fair about what the movement got right, because I don't want you walking away from this episode thinking that ACE research is bad, or that trauma isn't real, or that caring about kids' histories is a problem. That is not what I'm saying. 2/3 of children experience at least one potentially traumatic event before age 16. 2/3. Let's put that in terms you know. In a classroom of 30 kids, about 20 of them have experienced at least one traumatic event. Not someday, that's before they walked in today. And for kids with multiple ACEs, the effects aren't just additive, right? They compound. The neuroscience on chronic toxic stress is solid. A child living in prolonged stress, like the kind that comes from abuse or neglect or chaos at home, that child's brain is being shaped by that stress in ways that we can measure. The prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, self-regulation, attention, and decision-making. Chronic stress disrupts development in all those areas, and that disruption shows up in classrooms each and every day. Kids with significant trauma histories are 2.5 times more likely to experience academic difficulties. They're more likely to be suspended or expelled. They're at a higher risk for dropping out, for substance abuse, and for contact with the juvenile justice system. And all of this was being ignored before the trauma-informed movement came along. Think about the kid who blows up every time a teacher raises her voice. Before this movement, that was defiance. That was a 3-day suspension and a behavior contract. Nobody in that meeting asked what happened at home. Nobody asked whether the raised voice triggered something older and deeper than whatever was happening in that classroom. But the suspension didn't address anything. And 3 weeks later, the same thing happened again. the fundamental reframe of what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, that is clinically sound. And the recognition that zero tolerance discipline was failing kids, specifically those whose behavior were rooted in survival rather than defiance, that was well-founded. And here's something I really want you to hold in your brain because this is going to be important in a few minutes. Some trauma interventions actually work. Specific, targeted, evidence-based programs delivered by trained mental health professionals. Programs like CBITS, which is Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools. Programs like SPARKS, like Bounce Back. These are real clinical treatments with real evidence, with studies and outcomes data. But the key phrase here is delivered by trained mental health professionals. Because the problem developed when the entire concept of trauma-informed got handed to every teacher in every building with an 8-hour PD day, and good luck out there, friends. When the trauma-informed movement arrived, here's what actually happened on the ground in school buildings across the country. The hallways got louder. Classrooms were harder to manage. And when teachers tried to push back, when they asked for consistent consequences, for some kind of structure, the answer they kept getting was, we can't rely on traditional discipline. The data shows it disproportionately impacts students of color. And like I said in the last podcast episode, that data is real. The racial disparities in school discipline are documented, and they do deserve to be taken seriously. That part is not wrong. But in too many buildings, the response to that data became no consequences for anyone, which got framed as equity and compassion and as the trauma-informed thing to do. So I'm not arguing that we need more punishment. But I am arguing for a structure that is predictable and humane and is not always outsourced to the school counseling office. Because in practice, all of these things meant that, right? Just send them to the school counselor. Student verbally assaults a teacher, send them to the counselor. Student refuses work, threatens a peer, walks out of class for the 4th time this week, send them to the counselor. Not because the counselor has a therapeutic goal or an intervention protocol going for this kid, but because the admin has stepped back from discipline and the counselor's office is the only door that's left to knock on. And as you're listening to this, you probably already know what that feels like, right? Because you have been told explicitly, professionally, and repeatedly that you are not a disciplinarian. Your role is not punitive. You are not supposed to be the consequence. And yet there you are, fielding a parade of behavioral referrals with no administrative authority, nothing to lean on structurally, and an unspoken expectation that you are somehow going to contain what your building has decided it doesn't want to address. That is not a school counseling role. That is a pressure valve. And it leaves everybody, you and the teachers and even the students, feeling helpless. And what all that actually produced systemically was chaos. Students without structure, teachers without support. And in all of that, what should really be stopping us cold is that the students most harmed by that unraveling were often the exact students that the policy was designed to protect. Because students who've grown up in unpredictable, unsafe environments don't thrive in chaotic classrooms. They need consistency. They need to know someone trustworthy is in charge and the environment is safe. So removing all structure in the name of trauma-informed care isn't trauma-informed. It's the opposite. Hey, before we keep going, can I say something? Podcasting is powerful, but there is a ceiling to what we can do through your speakers. Because sometimes you don't just need more information. You need to sit across from someone and say, okay, this is what's actually happening on my campus, and have thoughtful people think it through with you in real time. That's what we're building with the very first School for School Counselors Summer Meetup. This is not a conference with rows of chairs and polite nodding. This is going to be a day and a half of meaningful work around the exact things that determine whether you walk into the school year feeling capable and confident or completely underwater by day 3. We'll talk about what the research actually supports in real schools, what happens when the hard days start bleeding into each other, and how to stay grounded when the job keeps asking for just one more thing. This is the room where you stop apologizing for thinking differently. You'll leave thinking more clearly. You'll have language for the conversations you've been avoiding. You'll have a deeper understanding of what makes you a remarkable human being in the middle of this work. And you'll walk back onto campus knowing exactly what you stand for. If you're looking for cute lessons and ASCA-approved scripts, this is not going to be your event. But if you're ready to do real work with school counselors who get it and spend time in real life with me, geeking out over school counseling, Columbus, Ohio, July 17th and 18th, 60 seats. When they're gone, they're gone. Ticket link is in the show notes, and I hope you join us. All right, back to the episode. So by 2019, you had a movement that had been scaled nationally and was producing real harm on the ground, and nobody stopped to ask whether there was actually evidence that this worked until 4 researchers did. In 2019, Maynard, Farina, Dell, and Kelly published a systematic review that should have stopped the trauma-informed school movement in its tracks. They set out to rigorously evaluate the evidence for trauma-informed approaches in schools. They searched 9 electronic databases. They even dug into what researchers call gray literature. So that's things like government reports, conference papers, internal program evaluations, and dissertations. Basically, the research that exists but never made it into a formal peer-reviewed journal. And they also reached out directly to researchers to ask about unpublished work. So they were thorough in a way that most reviews are not. And after all of that, after examining literally everything that existed, they found 0 studies that met rigorous inclusion criteria. 0 qualifying studies. Let me make sure you heard that. The entire trauma-informed school movement adopted across the country, backed by federal legislation, embedded in district policy, and delivered through professional development to hundreds of thousands of educators, had been implemented at national scale with 0 studies demonstrating that it worked. And as if it couldn't get worse, there was something even more serious than that. Because these researchers weren't just saying, we need more evidence. They explicitly warned that we, quote, do not know if using a trauma-informed approach could actually have unintended negative consequences. Y'all, that was a warning. And I will tell you, I have seen exactly what that warning looks like up close. I was sitting in an ACES training for teachers once, and I guess the presenter wanted to make the content feel more real. So she came up with what she probably thought was a super powerful activity. And I guess it was powerful, not in the way she anticipated. She asked everybody in the room to write down a personal ace on a square of paper. So 1 ace from their own history, and then crumple it up and throw it across the room. And whoever's paper landed near you, you were supposed to pick it up and read it out loud. And so the logic, I guess, was that the crumpling and the throwing was supposed to make it anonymous, and you could be real and vulnerable, and nobody would know it was yours. But I watched a teacher in that room, someone that I personally knew and knew had a very high ACE score, become completely dysregulated. She had to leave the presentation. She had to walk out of a professional development training because a presenter with good intentions and 0 clinical training had just asked a room full of adults to hand their trauma to a stranger to have it read aloud. And y'all, that teacher who worked on my campus had trouble at work for weeks afterward. That was not trauma-informed practice. That was trauma exposure. And those are not the same thing. That presenter wasn't a bad person. She probably genuinely cared about the teachers in that room, but she had been handed a framework, asked to deliver it, and really, from what I saw, had virtually no clinical training on what it means to actually work with trauma safely. So it wasn't all her failure, it was a systems failure. And it's exactly the kind of harm that the Maynard Review was warning about. The harm that happens when you scale something you don't fully understand. So Let me give you a distinction that your district's professional development almost certainly has never made. And this is where everything falls apart. There are two very different things that get called trauma-informed. One is trauma-specific interventions, targeted, evidence-based clinical treatments, programs like TFCBT, like CBITS, that are delivered by trained mental health professionals to specific students who need them. That category has real evidence and studies and outcomes. The other is trauma-informed approaches, whole school culture shifts, universal training for all staff, organizational philosophy changes. That's the category that Maynard and colleagues were examining. And that's the category that returned 0. The conflation of these two things, when we assume that the whole school framework rides on the coattails of the clinical research, is exactly where the damage happens. Since that 2019 review, other researchers have kept looking. In 2022, another team did the same kind of comprehensive search. They found 4 qualifying studies. 4, but all of them were rated at high risk of bias, and none could be generalized to other school contexts. The most recent critical review, which was just published last year, confirmed that the evidence for whole school trauma-informed approaches remains limited, and actually called on the field to stop treating good intention as equivalent to good evidence, which I'm wholeheartedly behind. The trauma-informed school movement was not built by people with bad intentions. Let me be very upfront. And people who have followed this are not bad people. The people who pushed for it cared about kids. But caring about kids is not the same thing as having evidence that what you're doing is helping them. And the most vulnerable children in our schools, the ones who have experienced the most adversity, deserve more than untested frameworks delivered by overwhelmed, undertrained educators. They deserve interventions that have actually been proven to work. So I want to give you language for this because you're going to need it. There is a difference between being trauma-informed and trauma-inspired. Trauma-informed means what it says. It's evidence-based, clinically grounded, delivered by trained professionals, evaluated for outcomes, and is rigorous. Trauma-inspired is something different. It takes its language from trauma research, and the intentions behind it are real, but it's disconnected from the clinical rigor that the research actually demands. If it isn't measured, supervised, and tied to outcomes, it isn't trauma-informed. It's trauma-inspired. The crumpled paper activity I described, that was trauma-inspired. Telling a teacher that a student's high A score means he can't be held accountable right now, totally trauma-inspired. An 8-hour PD that sends every teacher in your building back to their classroom as a frontline trauma responder with no clinical training, no supervision, and no follow-up plan, 1,000% trauma-inspired. And you've probably seen all 3 in your school. So here's what I need you to hear. Most of what gets called trauma-informed in schools right now is actually trauma-inspired. And the difference matters enormously for the kids in your building. This episode, I anticipate, is going to be very controversial with a lot of people, but it does name the failure in a research-driven way. And I'm going to be giving those resources on our website, so you can go look them up yourself. I have a masterclass coming up where we are going to build what replaces all of this trauma-inspired stuff. Because in my mastermind, we go places that a podcast episode just can't go, right? We are going to go into how the deficit thinking problem emerged, because research shows us that trauma-informed training, when done poorly, can actually make educators more likely to see students through a deficit lens, not less. We're going to look at the secondary traumatic stress data for teachers, because that's one other population that's being failed by this whole movement. And we're going to build out a clinical framework for what school counselors are specifically positioned to do when their role is protected and it's functioning the way it's supposed to. So the link to all this is in the show notes. You can join the mastermind for a month, see what we're building, and decide if you think that's where you belong. I think it is. I hope you're going to join us, but you can check it out for yourself. And also, I've put together a free action guide for this episode. It is a side-by-side comparison of trauma-inspired versus trauma-informed that you can print out and bring to your next meeting. So that'll be in the show notes too. And if this episode gave you words for something that you've been feeling, would you please share it? There are school counselors in your building and in your network who have been handed a trauma-inspired framework, but they were told it was evidence-based. So they need to hear this too. All right, my friend, if something about this trauma-informed movement has felt off for years, if pushing back on it made you feel like you were being the difficult one, I promise you, you were not being resistant. That was your clinical discernment doing its job. And now you have a name for what you were sensing. You were not the problem. You were asking the right question. I'm Steph Johnson, and I'll be back soon with another episode of the School for School Counselors podcast. In the meantime, keep the evidence in mind. How many rigorous studies support trauma-informed schools? That would be 0. Take care.